Hey, what's up? It's Jake from Nimbus DevOps, and I'm here in Python 1.8 going to talk about names and namespaces. So, what in the heck is a name? Well, think about this. If you ever went to a library and you asked somebody where a book was, they'd be like, "Oh, go to the second floor, look in section, 12, and go to row 3, and then the number of the book is, you know, 86.12A or something like that." And you would go upstairs and you'd go to the section and the row and all that stuff, and you figured out where the book was. Well, the way you organize your code, and we talked a little bit about this in the previous video, it really helps other people who've never used your code figure out where things are. And you want to make that as predictable as possible because it adds to the elegance and the readability of your code. So we're going to try to explain this as it pertains to names and namespaces. So in coding, we kind of have the same issue, right? You have to tell me, well, where is that book? So let's say I go to an interactive shell and I say that I have a number n, and that number is 3. Okay. And if I said print n and I spelled the word correctly, it would print 3. Okay. So what does this represent? Well, n, as we've been talking about in algebra, would be like a variable, right? N equals 3. And then print is just a way of Python telling Python, I want you to output a value to the terminal inside the interactive shell. And specifically, I want you to output the value of n, the variable n. So in other languages, these actually are called variables. But in Python, this is referred to as a name. Okay, so we have a variable n, and it has a name, right? So this variable name is n, and its value is 3. So that's essentially what a name is in Python, right? So why is this important? It's just part of the language. It's just part of the lingo and figuring out how to communicate with other people, other Pythonistas, as they are called. Um, so names basically just refer to objects. Okay. It's introduced by this name binding operator. So anything that you would normally see in math, so plus, minus, um, times, divided by, equals, greater than, less than. These are all operators. That's what we call them. And in the case of an equals sign in Python, this is a name binding operator. So that's how you assign a value to a variable. It binds the name n to this variable, and in this case, a value of 3. Um, so yeah, so that's pretty much it. You could make this anything. It could be my phone underscore number is, and then I'll put in quotes to make it what's called a string, which is just it understands as a collection of characters, like 555 555 1212, and that's my phone number, right? And then if I wanted to print my phone number, it would just print the phone number. And it saves these. If I wanted to print n again, it would just print 3. So here we have a name, phone number, and a name binding operator with a value, which is this, encapsulated in quotes, which makes it the type string. So we know that this object has a type, right? So in this case, Python says, oh, you passed me a value with quotes, so I know that the type is a string. So now we know that it has a name and it has a string, or a type string. So just remember that each Python object has an identity, as we talked about before, which you probably don't know, right? The ID, but you do know it has a type and a value. And in this case, with phone number, it's a type string, and the value, or the phone number, yeah, is a type string, and the value is 555-555-1212. In the case of n, it has a type number, right? Which in Python, it's probably good for us to talk about what is a number. So really what it is it's an integer. So, and you'll see integer abbreviated as int. So you'll see type. Oh, string. Okay, I know that. He talked about that. What is the type of n? It'll say int. And you're like, well, what does that mean? Well, it just means it's an integer. Okay, it's a non-decimal real number. If it were a decimal, it would have a type float because it has a floating decimal point. So that's um, a couple of types for you as we get into this and you start seeing things. Um, it's even possible to do things where you have multiple uh, values. So let's say I have a database full of employees, right? And you have probably done this in Excel, and you have a employee column, and then there's multiple employees, right? And I'm just going to put this inside some brackets to say, hey Python, this is an object that has multiple values in it. And maybe the employee has like an age, and in this case, that age, the person is 45 years old. And then I'm going to say comma to denote that there's more information. What is their job role, right? And then I'll say this person is the CTO, comma, because I'm going to keep going. You just don't. Well, you can do as many as you want. Maybe you have a social security number and you keep that in your database for some strange reason because you're in HR. I don't know, and it's like ABC123. Okay, and that would be your social security number. And then I'm just going to put a comma here so that the line doesn't break. And then I'm going to close this little bracket and hit enter. Okay, so now if I say, what is your, now what happens if I just type employee? Boom, look at that. So this variable name, right, it has a name assignment operator of an equal sign, is employee. What type is this? Well, this is called a dictionary. So a dictionary is just where you have multiple values, and each of these values, age, role, and social security number right here, have also have a value of these values, and we call this a key value pair. So this is the key, this is the value, this is the key, this is the value, this is the key, this is the value. So instead of saying employee equals age or whatever, then it's like um, you're just assigning it multiple objects within objects, and those objects also have values. So this is kind of a way, if I were to say age equals 45 and do an assignment operator of age equals 45, it's a way of doing that inside of these brackets so that this one name, this one object, has a dictionary with multiple values inside, or with multiple objects inside of it, of which each have their own value, if that makes sense. So if that's confusing, let me know. But like I said, we're going to get into all this in much greater detail later. This is just a broad overview of how this author chose to approach the introduction of Python. And I think that since most of you have used Excel, it makes a little bit more sense. But if I were to have, if you would imagine this as an employee tab or whatever, and you'd have a column for age and a value for 45, or a row for age and a cell that says 45 or whatever, I think you'd get the idea. So this is what a dictionary looks like. It's possible to have values stored to keys with multiple keys inside of an object that represents a dictionary that's assigned to a single object, where this employee is now just all these things. And this is how databases work. So when you're using a database and storing somebody's information, that's exactly how it works. It might be a little bit more sophisticated, but that's essentially how it works. And you can check these kinds of things too with type, right? So if I say, what is the type, or type, and then of n right here, it just says class int. So that's an integer. What is the type of phone number? It's a class string because we use quotes. Okay, well, what is the type of employee? It's a class dictionary. And this will become more important later because there's certain things you can't add strings, but you can add integers, and it'll become important later. So if n is 3, and I said, oh, cool, what is 2 plus n? We should get 5, right? And that's true. But if I made a variable x, and I set it to 3, but I put it in quotes, you can see that the type of x is a string. So if I tried to say 2 plus x, it's going to give you an error because you can't add an integer and a string together. Now, if I reassigned x the value of 3 as an integer, and then I said, okay, now what type is x? And it says it's an integer. And I said, okay, what's 2 plus x? Now it'll work. It's 5, right? Or if I did n plus x, that would also work because come out as 6. So that's why types matter, because there's certain things you can do and can't do when you combine different types. So we'll get into that in great detail, but just know that at a high level and just kind of go from there. In the next chapter, chapter 2 that I'll be posting, I'll go over this in a lot more detail. So in summary, N, phone number, employee, those are all names, right? They can be used to get data from our code. You have to store them somewhere. They are stored in memory or stored in your code, right? And whenever you need to retrieve those objects, you can just tell Python to go fetch them. But you need somewhere to hold all of these names. And this is where we get into namespaces. So a namespace is just a mapping from names to objects. That's all it is. So an example is like the built-in names in program. They have stuff that's built in that has its own values and stuff like that. It has its own namespace. But I guess the usefulness of namespaces comes in is that they allow you to define and organize your names to be a little bit clearer so that they don't overlap or interfere with other things. So let's say that employee has a dictionary, right? And it has age, role, and social security number, but you have a different part of the application that also uses employee, which I wouldn't do, but if that were a thing, you could create a separate namespace and it might have a dictionary but have different keys with different values. And those two wouldn't interfere with each other because the code would run separately with different namespaces. So I guess another way to explain that is like if you think back to the library example, you remember the book was like on the second floor in the whatever row and all that stuff, right? You could be like, if you remember my last video, I did a code example where I said from math import factorial, right? So we could be like from in the library dot the second floor dot section 123 dot row underscore 8 import whatever that book is. So this would be a namespace here. So you start with the library namespace. This is a namespace. And the namespace is all separated with these dots, right? So you start with the library namespace, and with the dot, you go into it. So it's like, okay, from library, dot inside the library. Second floor, dot inside the second floor. Section, dot inside the section. Row, now it'll be looking in the row and say import the book. So this will be a little clearer when we start to use the real code examples. But I guess for now, the takeaway is just to remember that namespaces are where names are associated with objects, right? So in this case, the name of this book would be associated with row 8, but it also is associated with section 123 by saying its association is it's in row 8 and its name is this. And it's associated with the second floor by saying, yeah, the second floor, we're close to me and this book, or we're like homies. And how do you know the book? Oh, because they're in section whatever and row this. Like it's like it's like how you connect your friends together, right? Like you know this person through this person through this person, and each one of those people would be a namespace. So that's a very strange concept to kind of start with. I'm still not 100% sold that this is the best way to teach Python through the inside out method is what I'm calling it. But that's what it is, and that's what we're going to go with. So digest that, let that sink in, and then let me know if you have any questions, and we'll just keep going.